A large oak tree on a warm summer day lifts about 100 gallons of water from the soil to its highest leaves. 100 gallons, straight up. No motor, no pump, no moving parts. That water travels through tubes inside the tree that are, by the time they reach the top, thinner than a human hair. And some of these trees are 300 feet tall. 370 feet. In the case of the tallest redwoods, that is taller than the Statue of Liberty. So I want you to hold that picture in your mind. 370 feet of water hanging in microscopic tubes, rising against gravity, inside a living thing that has no muscles, no heart, no engine. Nothing that any engineer would recognize as a pump. And it does this all day, every day, all summer long, without stopping, without maintenance, without complaint. And I want to tell you something that will bother you. We do not fully understand how this works. We have a very good story. A compelling story, a story that most biologists accept. But when you push on that story, when you really lean on it with the weight of physics, some parts of it start to creak. That is what I want to investigate with you today. But not just the standard answer you get in a biology textbook. I want to chase this thing down because the moment you start asking careful questions about how a tree moves water, you find yourself staring at one of the most beautiful unsolved puzzles in all of science. Let us start with what seems obvious. Surely the tree just sucks water up, right? Like a straw. You put a straw in a glass of water, you suck on the top and the water comes up. The tree evaporates water out of its leaves. That creates a kind of suction, and water gets pulled up from the roots. A straightforward mechanical process. Your first instinct is probably that this is a solved problem, that someone worked it out 200 years ago and everyone moved on. Except here is a fact that should stop you in your tracks. A suction pump, the best suction pump you can build, cannot lift water higher than about 34 feet. That is it. That is the absolute ceiling for suction. Why? Because suction is not really pulling. When you suck on a straw, you are not grabbing the water and hauling it up. What you are really doing is removing air pressure from the top. The atmosphere pushes down on the surface of the water in the glass, and with less pressure above, the water gets pushed up. But atmospheric pressure is only so strong. It can push a column of water up about 34 feet before the weight of the water column exactly matches the pressure of the atmosphere. After that, nothing. You could create a perfect vacuum at the top and the water will not rise 1 inch beyond 34 feet. So suction is out. It cannot be suction. Not for a 100-foot tree and certainly not for a 300-foot redwood. All right, so maybe it is capillary action. You have probably seen this. Dip a very thin glass tube into water and the water climbs up the inside of the tube all by itself. No suction needed. The water molecules are attracted to the glass. They grip the walls, and they pull themselves up. The thinner the tube, the higher the water climbs. And trees have very thin tubes inside them called xylem. So maybe capillary action does the job. Let us check the numbers. The xylem tubes in a tree trunk are roughly 20 to 200 micrometers across. That is thin, but not extraordinarily thin. If you calculate how high capillary action alone can lift water in a tube of that diameter, you get about 1 meter, 3 feet, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on the exact size, but roughly 3 feet. 3 feet, the tree needs 300. Capillary action is off by a factor of 100. So that is two ideas that do not work. Suction fails at 34 feet. Capillary action fails at 3 feet. And the tree needs to move water 10 times beyond the suction limit and 100 times beyond the capillary limit. Something else is going on. Now there is a third thing people sometimes suggest, root pressure. The roots actively push water upward, and this is real. Roots do generate a small positive pressure. You can observe it directly. If you cut the top off certain plants, water will ooze out of the stump. The roots are pushing. But root pressure is weak. It can get water up maybe a few meters. In some plants on a cool morning, root pressure will push water out through the leaf edges as little droplets, a process called guttation. You may have seen these tiny drops on grass blades early in the morning and thought it was dew. It is not dew, it is water, the roots pushed all the way out. But root pressure cannot lift water to the top of a tall tree. Not even close. And here is the strange thing. Measurements show that in many tall trees, especially conifers, there is essentially no detectable root pressure at all. So whatever is lifting the water, the roots are barely helping. We have now eliminated the three most intuitive explanations Suction caps out at 34 feet. Capillary action gives you 3 feet. Root pressure adds a few meters at best, and the tree needs to get water 300 feet up against gravity through tubes thinner than a strand of spaghetti. So what is really happening? In 1894, two Irish plant scientists named Henry Dixon and John Joly proposed an idea. It was radical at the time, and in some ways it still is. They said the water is not pushed up from below, it is pulled up from above, not by suction, by something more direct. The water molecules themselves form a continuous chain from root to leaf, and when water evaporates from the leaf surface, it tugs on that chain. The tug travels down the entire length of the tree, all the way to the roots, pulling water upward the way you might pull a rope. This is called the cohesion-tension theory, and it has been the dominant explanation for over a century. Let me walk you through it, because the physics is gorgeous, but I am going to be more careful than your textbook. I want you to see where the theory is strong and where it starts to wobble. First, let me tell you about the pipes themselves, because they are extraordinary. The xylem tubes are not living cells. This is a crucial fact that most people miss. The cells that form the xylem die during development. Their contents dissolve, their end walls perforate or disappear, and what is left behind is a hollow tube made of dead cell wall material, lignified cellulose, mostly. It is basically wood, so the water transport system of a tree is made of dead tissue. There is no living membrane pumping water along, no cilia beating, no cellular machinery driving the flow. Just dead, hollow pipes. In hardwood trees, these pipes are called vessels, and they can be quite wide, up to 500 micrometers in diameter and up to 10 meters long. They form when individual cells called vessel elements stack on top of each other, and their shared walls dissolve, creating a continuous tube. In conifers, the system is different. Instead of wide vessels, conifers have tracheids. These are much smaller, rarely more than 30 micrometers wide and 5 millimeters long. And unlike vessels, tracheids do not have open ends. Water has to pass through tiny pits in the cell walls to move from one tracheid to the next. It is like drinking through a series of coffee stirrers with mesh screens between them instead of one wide garden hose. This distinction matters enormously, and I will come back to it. For now, just hold the picture. Dead pipes, no pump. Water goes up. Start at the top of the tree, in the leaves. Each leaf has thousands of tiny pores on its surface called stomata. When the sun is shining and photosynthesis is happening, these pores are open. Water inside the leaf evaporates through these pores into the air. This process is called transpiration. Now, the pores in the leaf are extraordinarily small. We are talking 2 to 5 nanometers across in the cell walls of the leaf tissue. At that scale, the surface tension of water is enormous relative to the volume. The water forms tiny curved surfaces, menisci, inside these pores, and the curvature generates a powerful inward pull, much more powerful than you would get in the larger xylem tubes of the trunk. So the initial tug, the thing that starts the chain reaction, happens at the leaf surface, in pores so small that the physics of surface tension really takes over. Let me give you a sense of the pressure difference we are talking about. The atmosphere around a leaf on a dry day has a water potential of roughly negative 100 megapascals. That is an insanely low number. The leaf itself might be at negative 1.5 megapascals. The stem at negative 0.6. The roots at negative 0.2. There is a smooth gradient of water potential from the soil, through the roots, up the stem, into the leaves, and out into the atmosphere. Water flows spontaneously from high potential to low potential, just as a ball rolls downhill. The atmosphere is the bottom of the hill, the soil is the top, and the tree is just the slope in between. Think about how counterintuitive that is. We think of the soil as being below the tree and the atmosphere as being above it. Spatially, the water goes up, but energetically it goes down. The water is rolling downhill the entire time, driven by the enormous dryness of the air. The sun provides the energy by heating the leaf and powering evaporation. Gravity is working against the flow, but the energy gradient from soil to atmosphere is so steep that gravity barely matters. It is like a river flowing uphill because someone tilted the whole landscape. That pull is transmitted downward through the water column, and this is where the magic of water comes in. Water molecules stick to each other. They form hydrogen bonds. Each water molecule has a slightly positive end and a slightly negative end, and these oppositely charged ends attract neighboring water molecules. The result is that water is remarkably cohesive. It holds together. In a thin tube, a column of water behaves almost like a solid rod. Pull on the top, and the whole column moves. Think of it this way. Imagine a chain made of water molecules, stretching from the roots to the leaves. When water evaporates at the top, it is like someone tugging on the top of the chain. The tug travels down, molecule by molecule, all the way to the roots. At the bottom, the pull draws more water out of the soil and into the root. And the key word is continuous. The chain must not break. From root tip to leaf surface, the water column must be one uninterrupted thread. If it breaks anywhere, the system above the break loses its connection to the water supply below. A gap of even a single millimeter is fatal to that particular pathway. Now here is something that should make your eyebrows go up. Water molecules do not stick together permanently. Each hydrogen bond between two water molecules lasts only about a trillionth of a second. Then it breaks. But almost immediately, each molecule forms a new hydrogen bond with a different neighbor. The bonds are constantly breaking and reforming, billions of times per second. It is not a static rope. It is more like a crowd of people holding hands. At any given instant, almost everyone is holding someone's hand. But the specific hand you are holding changes constantly. Despite the constant shuffling, the crowd moves together. Pull on one end, and the whole crowd moves in that direction. It is an elegant picture, and there is good experimental evidence for it. In the late 1800s, a German botanist cut down a 70-foot oak tree and placed the base of the trunk into a barrel of picric acid solution. The acid was drawn up through the trunk, not pushed by roots because the acid killed the root tissue immediately. Something was pulling it from above. The transpiration from the remaining leaves was dragging the fluid upward through dead tissue. Here is another piece of evidence. If you measure the diameter of a tree trunk very carefully, you find that it shrinks slightly during the day and expands at night. During the day, transpiration is high, water is being pulled hard, and the tension in the water column actually squeezes the xylem tubes inward, narrowing the trunk by a tiny amount. At night, when the stomata close and transpiration slows, the tension relaxes and the trunk expands back. The tree literally gets thinner during the day because water is being yanked upward so hard. You can measure this with sensitive instruments. A large tree might shrink by a millimeter or two in diameter between dawn and afternoon. Not much, but real, and it is exactly what the cohesion-tension theory predicts. There is something else worth noting. People sometimes ask, how did the water column get established in the first place? If you need a continuous chain of water from root to leaf and the chain cannot form if there are any gaps, how does it start? The answer is that the tree builds the chain as it grows. When a tree is a seedling, only a few inches tall, the water column is trivially short. Capillary action and root pressure can easily fill those tiny initial vessels. As the tree grows taller, new xylem cells are added at the tips. Each new cell is filled with water from the cell below it before the living cell contents die and the vessel opens up for transport. The water column is extended gradually, cell by cell, inch by inch, over years and decades. The tree never has to fill a 300-foot column from scratch. It grows into it. So far, so good. The cohesion-tension theory is beautiful, but there is a problem. For this to work, the water inside the tree must be under tension. Not pressure. Tension, negative pressure. The water is being pulled, not pushed. And that means the water is in a very unusual state. And under normal circumstances, if you pull on a liquid hard enough, it boils. Not because it is hot, because the pressure drops so low that the liquid cannot hold itself together. You have probably seen this in a syringe. Pull the plunger back far enough and bubbles appear in the water, even at room temperature. The water cavitates, it forms vapor bubbles. Now let me make sure you feel the strangeness of this. We are used to thinking of pressure as something that is always positive. You pump up a tire. The pressure inside is 2 atmospheres, 3 atmospheres. A deep-sea diver experiences hundreds of atmospheres pressing in. Pressure is how hard something pushes. But inside a tree, the water is under negative pressure. It is being stretched, pulled apart. The molecules are being forced away from each other, farther than they want to be. This is not a metaphor. This is a measurable physical state. You can confirm it with a device called a pressure bomb, which is exactly as dramatic as it sounds. You take a small twig from a tree, seal it into a chamber with the cut end sticking out, and slowly increase the gas pressure inside the chamber. At some point, water starts to ooze from the cut end. The pressure you had to apply to squeeze that water out tells you how much tension the water was under when the twig was alive on the tree. And the numbers come back negative. Strongly negative. In a tall tree, the tension in the water column at the top can be enormous. Let me walk through the arithmetic with you because the numbers matter. A column of water 1 meter tall exerts a pressure of about a 1/100th of an atmosphere at its base. So a 100-meter column, which is about 330 feet, exerts about 1 atmosphere of gravitational pressure. But the tree needs more than just supporting the water column. It also needs to overcome the friction of water flowing through incredibly narrow xylem tubes. Taking everything into account, a 100-meter tree needs a tension of roughly -15 atmospheres just to hold the water up and keep it moving. During peak flow on a hot afternoon, the total tension at the top can reach -20 or -25 atmospheres. And if the soil is dry, making it harder for the roots to extract water, add another 10 atmospheres of tension on top of that. -25 atmospheres. To put that in perspective, a tire on your car runs at about 2 atmospheres of positive pressure. Imagine the opposite of 12 or 13 tire pressures, but pulling outward instead of pushing inward. That is what the water at the top of a tall tree is experiencing. Water in this state is metastable. It should, by all rights, boil. The water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at normal atmospheric pressure. But boiling is really about pressure, not temperature. If you reduce the pressure enough, water will boil at room temperature. At -25 atmospheres, water at any temperature should instantly vaporize. If you somehow had a beaker of water at that tension on your lab bench, it would explode into vapor faster than you could blink. But inside the xylem of a tree, the water holds together. Why? Because there are no nucleation sites. Boiling, like freezing, needs a seed. A tiny bubble, a rough spot on the wall, a speck of dust, a dissolved gas molecule that comes out of solution. Something for the vapor to form around. Without that seed, the transition from liquid to vapor simply cannot begin. The xylem tubes are relatively smooth, the water fills them completely, and the initial conditions when the water column formed back when the tree was a tiny seedling were such that no air was introduced. So the water hangs in this impossible state, stretched like a rubber band that should have snapped but has not because nothing has nudged it yet. It is like balancing a pencil on its tip. In theory, a perfectly balanced pencil could stand upright forever. In practice, the tiniest vibration knocks it over. The water in a tree is that balanced pencil, except it is 300 feet tall, and it stays balanced for months at a time. But here's where the trouble starts. The pencil does fall, regularly. The water does break. It happens all the time. On a hot afternoon, when the tension is highest, tiny bubbles do form inside the xylem. This is cavitation. The word comes from the Latin for hollow. A void opens up inside the water column. The bubble expands, fills the tube, and blocks it. The continuous water column snaps. That tube is now useless. It has suffered what botanists call an embolism, just like a blood clot in your veins, except this is an air bubble in a water pipe. If you put a sensitive microphone against a tree trunk on a summer afternoon, you can actually hear it. Little clicks, tiny snapping sounds, pop, 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 pop. Each one is a water column breaking inside a xylem tube. Each one is a small catastrophe for the tree's plumbing. I find this remarkable. You can literally listen to a tree breaking on the inside. In quiet conditions with the right equipment, the sound is unmistakable. Researchers have recorded it, and the clicks get faster as the day gets hotter and drier because the tension increases and more tubes are snapping. Now, think about what this means for the tree's survival. A large tree might have hundreds of thousands of individual xylem conduits running from root to crown. On a stressful day, a significant fraction of them cavitate. The conducting capacity of the trunk drops, less water reaches the leaves begin to close their stomata to reduce water loss, which also reduces photosynthesis. The tree is throttling itself, cutting off its own water supply and its own food supply simultaneously. If too many tubes cavitate, the whole system collapses. The tree cannot supply enough water to the crown. The leaves wilt. The branches die back. Eventually, the tree dies. This is in fact exactly how many trees die during severe droughts. It is not that they dry out the way a piece of paper dries. It is that their internal plumbing fails catastrophically. The water columns break faster than they can be repaired, the hydraulic system collapses, and the tree can no longer sustain itself. And here is the part that keeps people up at night. Under normal conditions, not drought, just a regular warm summer day, cavitation happens constantly. A large tree might lose a significant fraction of its conducting capacity every single afternoon. The tubes get blocked, the water supply to the crown should drop. The tree should be in serious trouble every day by 3 in the afternoon, but it does not seem to be. The tree is fine, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Something is repairing the damage, something is clearing those bubbles and refilling the tubes, and we do not fully understand how. In small herbaceous plants, the repair is straightforward. At night, when transpiration stops, root pressure builds up. The positive pressure from the roots pushes water back into the empty tubes and dissolves the gas bubbles. Morning comes, the system is restored, and the process starts over. It is a daily cycle of breaking and healing. Researchers have watched this happen using magnetic resonance imaging on grapevines. They put a living grapevine inside an MRI machine and watched individual vessels cavitate during the day and refill at night. When the lights were switched off, the embolized vessels began refilling within 2 to 3 hours. It was like watching a wound heal and fast forward. But in tall trees, the situation is much harder. Root pressure is negligible or absent. There is no strong push from below to refill the tubes. And even if there were, pushing water up 300 feet requires real force. You would need a positive pressure of about 10 atmospheres at the base to push water to the top. No root can generate that. Yet the tubes get refilled anyway. Measurements show that the hydraulic conductivity of the trunk remains remarkably stable through the growing season, even as embolisms form and accumulate every afternoon. Something is repairing those vessels, and it appears to involve the living cells that surround the dead xylem tubes. See, this is an important detail that often gets overlooked. The xylem tubes themselves are dead. At maturity, the cell contents die and you are left with hollow pipes. That is all they are. Microscopic pipes. But surrounding those pipes are living parenchyma cells. The dead tubes are not alone. They are embedded in a matrix of living tissue, and that living tissue has access to energy. It has sugars, it has membrane pumps, it has the molecular machinery of a living cell, and there is growing evidence that these living cells actively pump water, possibly driven by osmotic gradients, back into embolized vessels to repair them. Some researchers have found that starch stored in these parenchyma cells gets converted to sugar during repair events. The sugar creates a high concentration of dissolved particles near the embolized vessel. Water is drawn toward the sugar by osmosis. The vessel refills. The gas bubble dissolves. The tube returns to service. It is like having a paramedic crew stationed next to every water pipe. When a pipe breaks, the paramedics rush in, inject a sugar solution, and let osmosis do the rest. Except the paramedics are microscopic, the pipe is thinner than a hair, and the whole repair happens while the surrounding pipes are under enormous negative pressure that should make the repair thermodynamically impossible. But the details are murky, the energetics are not well understood, the molecular machinery has not been fully identified, and the idea that repair can happen while surrounding vessels are under significant tension raises difficult thermodynamic questions. How do you push water into a tube that is surrounded by tubes under negative pressure? The water should get sucked right back out. It is like trying to inflate a balloon inside a vacuum chamber. Some researchers think the answer involves local compartmentalization. The damaged tube gets hydraulically isolated from its neighbors. The surrounding cells create a small pocket of positive pressure. The bubble dissolves, and then the tube reconnects to the network. But the details of how this isolation and reconnection work at the molecular level remain unclear. Let me push deeper, because there is another layer to this mystery. The cohesion-tension theory requires water to sustain enormous negative pressures without breaking, -15, -20, -25 atmospheres, and it does inside trees. But when scientists try to reproduce these tensions in the laboratory, the results are deeply inconsistent. In the 1870s, a physicist spun a sealed glass capillary on a centrifuge to create tension in the water inside. The column broke at tensions of only about -0.5 an atmosphere. Other researchers, using extremely clean water in very smooth containers, have achieved negative pressures of -20 or -30 atmospheres. But these are heroic experiments with ultra-pure water in pristine conditions. The experimenters had to go to extraordinary lengths of specially prepared glass tubes, degassed distilled water, meticulous cleaning to remove every speck of contamination. Under those pampered conditions, yes, water can sustain impressive tensions, but the water inside a tree is not ultra-pure. It contains dissolved minerals, potassium, calcium, sugars, amino acids, proteins, lipids, and all sorts of organic compounds. The sap is a messy solution, and the walls of the xylem are not perfectly smooth glass. They have pits, perforations, and textured surfaces. They are lined with organic compounds that can trap microbubbles. So how does the tree maintain these enormous tensions in water that is not especially pure, flowing through pipes that are not especially smooth? Some of the conditions that should trigger cavitation, dissolved gases, rough surfaces, organic contaminants, are present all the time. And yet the tree works, the water holds, most of the time. Nobody has adequately explained why tree xylem sap, which should be far worse than laboratory water at sustaining tension, manages to do so day after day under field conditions. In 2004, a group of scientists from Würzburg published a massive review challenging the entire framework. They examined over 300 research papers and concluded that the cohesion-tension theory, at least as the sole explanation, was inadequate. They proposed what they called a multi-force theory. The idea is that water ascent in trees is not driven by one mechanism, but by an interplay of several. Cohesion and tension, yes, but also capillarity, osmotic pressure gradients between the xylem and surrounding tissues, recirculation between the xylem and the phloem, and possibly even active transport by membrane proteins in the parenchyma cells. They likened the tree to a series of canal locks. You know how a ship goes through a canal with locks where water levels are raised in stages? They suggested the tree might work similarly. Instead of one continuous water column under enormous tension from root to leaf, there might be functional segments, each maintained by local forces. The tension in any one segment would be much less extreme. The segments hand off water from one to the next, like a bucket brigade. The idea is provocative. If true, it would mean the water in a tree is not in as extreme a state as we thought. You would not need tensions of -25 atmospheres. If the column is broken into segments, each supported locally, the thermodynamic problem becomes less severe. The cavitation problem becomes less severe. In many ways, it is a more comfortable picture. And there is some supporting evidence. Researchers have found that the parenchyma cells surrounding the xylem can create local osmotic pressures. They can convert stored starch into sugar, changing the concentration of dissolved particles in the fluid near the xylem. This changes the water potential locally, and could in principle help move water from one segment to the next. It would be like having little helper pumps stationed along the pipeline, each contributing a small push. Other researchers have pointed to the phloem, the second transport system in trees, that carries sugars from leaves to roots. The phloem and xylem run parallel to each other throughout the tree, and there is evidence of water cycling between them. Water moves up in the xylem and some of it recirculates down through the phloem, then back into the xylem again. This could create a kind of internal circulation that helps maintain the water column. This was controversial, to put it mildly. 45 scientists signed a letter to the journal defending the classical cohesion-tension theory. They argued that the multi-force idea was inconsistent with the bulk of experimental evidence. The disagreement was sharp. One side said the old theory was completely misleading. The other side said the challenge was itself misleading. The truth, as is often the case in science, probably lies somewhere in between. The cohesion-tension mechanism is almost certainly a major player. The evidence for tension in the xylem is strong. Trees do shrink during the day. Cut a twig off a tree, put it in a pressure chamber, and you can measure the tension directly. It is real. But whether tension is the only force, or whether it works alongside a collection of other mechanisms, is genuinely unresolved. Let me give you one more piece of this puzzle that I find particularly haunting. A mature oak tree transpires roughly 40,000 gallons of water per year. Let that number settle. 40,000 gallons. That is about 110 gallons per day during the growing season. A giant sequoia can move 500 gallons a day. And remember, less than 5% of that water is actually used by the tree for growth and metabolism. The rest, 95 to 99%, is simply evaporated out of the leaves, gone into the atmosphere. So the tree is not really using this water. It is moving it. It is acting as a pipeline from the soil to the sky. The water goes in at the bottom and comes out at the top, and the tree is just the conduit. But this pipeline has no pump, no external energy source except the sun heating the leaf surface and driving evaporation. The entire system runs on the free energy of evaporation and the molecular stickiness of water. Engineers look at this and shake their heads. We cannot build anything like it. We can build pumps that move water to great heights, of course. But our pumps use motors, electricity, moving parts. They break. They need maintenance. They consume vast amounts of energy. A tree does it with tubes thinner than a hair, no moving parts, and the only energy input is sunlight. And there is one more thing. The water inside those tubes at the top of a tall tree is in a state that should not exist. It is liquid water under conditions where physics says it should be vapor. It is stretched beyond its equilibrium. It is metastable. Every moment, it is a tiny disturbance away from catastrophic failure, and yet it persists. Tube after tube, day after day, year after year. I want to step back now and tell you what I think is really going on, as honestly as I can. The cohesion-tension theory captures the dominant mechanism. Evaporation pulls. Cohesion transmits the pull. Water moves up. The evidence for this is overwhelming and has been confirmed by multiple independent methods over more than a century. But the theory in its simplest form is incomplete. It does not adequately explain how trees survive the constant onslaught of cavitation. It does not fully explain how embolized vessels get repaired, especially in tall trees without root pressure. It does not explain why the water in the xylem holds together under tensions that laboratory experiments suggest it should not withstand. And the multi-force theory, while not widely accepted as a replacement, raises legitimate questions about whether other mechanisms contribute. What I suspect is that the tree is doing something more sophisticated than we have given it credit for. The living cells that surround the dead xylem pipes are not just passive bystanders. They are active participants. They monitor the state of the water column. They intervene when things go wrong. They pump sugars and ions to create local osmotic gradients. They may even use specialized membrane proteins to actively transport water in ways we have not fully characterized. The tree, in other words, is not just a bundle of passive pipes with water hanging in them by surface tension. It is a managed system, an engineered system, if you will, except the engineer is 400 million years of evolution. And the engineering is so good, so seamless, so quiet, that for over a century we assumed it was simple. We assumed the pipes and the water were the whole story. We are beginning to realize that the story is much richer than that. Let me tell you one more thing that I find wonderful. The speed at which water moves through a tree varies enormously by species. In a red oak, a ring-porous hardwood, water moves at about 92 feet per hour, almost 100 feet every hour. In a basswood, a diffuse porous tree, it moves at 11 feet per hour. In a pine tree, where the conducting elements are tiny tracheids instead of wide vessels, it moves at 6 feet per hour. 92 feet per hour versus 6 feet per hour. A 15-to-1 speed difference. And that difference is almost entirely explained by the diameter of the tubes. Remember the Hagen-Poiseuille equation from fluid dynamics? It says the flow rate through a tube is proportional to the fourth power of the diameter. If you double the diameter, you get 16 times the flow. Trees that evolved wider xylem vessels can move water much faster, but they pay a price. Wider tubes are more vulnerable to cavitation. The bubbles that form are larger and harder to repair. It is a trade-off. Speed versus safety. And different tree species have found different compromises. Conifers, with their tiny tracheids, are slow but safe. They can handle extreme cold, extreme drought, enormous tensions without breaking. That is why the tallest trees in the world, the coast redwoods, are conifers. They can sustain the enormous tensions needed to move water 370 feet because their tiny tubes resist cavitation. Each tracheid is so small that even if it cavitates, the bubble cannot spread. The pits between tracheids act as check valves. An air bubble in one tracheid is stopped at the pit membrane and cannot propagate to its neighbors. The tree sacrifices speed for safety, and that safety is what allows it to grow to absurd heights. Broadleaf trees, with their wider vessels, are fast but fragile. They move more water, they grow faster, they support bigger leaves, but they are more vulnerable to drought and freezing. The wide vessels are like a superhighway for water. Flow rate through a tube scales with the fourth power of the diameter. If you double the tube width, you get 16 times the flow. That is the Hagen-Poiseuille law at work. A vessel 500 micrometers wide conducts the same amount of water as hundreds of thousands of tiny tracheids occupying the same cross-sectional area. It is fantastically efficient, but those wide tubes are catastrophically vulnerable. A larger tube has more dissolved gas, more surface irregularities, and a bigger air bubble when cavitation occurs. And wide tubes cannot be easily repaired once they embolize, because the volume of gas that needs to be dissolved is much larger. Freezing is particularly dangerous for wide vessel trees. When water freezes, dissolved gases come out of solution and form bubbles. You have seen this if you have ever frozen a bottle of sparkling water. When the ice thaws, those bubbles can nucleate cavitation. The wider the vessel, the larger the bubble, the more likely it is to expand under tension and block the tube permanently. That is why many broadleaf trees drop their leaves in autumn. It is not just about saving energy or avoiding snow damage. It is partly an emergency shutdown of the hydraulic system before winter freeze-thaw cycles destroy it. They let the xylem go dormant, except that many of their vessels will embolize during winter and grow an entirely new set of conducting vessels in the spring. A fresh ring of xylem built from scratch every year. Conifers do not need to do this. Their tiny tracheids survive freezing because the bubbles that form are so small they dissolve harmlessly when the ice melts. That is why conifers can stay green all winter. Their plumbing survives the cold. So the whole life strategy of a tree, whether it is evergreen or deciduous, whether it lives in the tropics or the Arctic, how tall it grows, how fast it grows, is intimately connected to the physics of water transport. The plumbing determines the architecture. The architecture determines the ecology. The ecology determines which trees you see when you walk through a forest. And all of it rests on this one extraordinary fact. Water sticks to itself. Hydrogen bonds, those tiny, weak, fleeting attractions between the slightly positive hydrogen atoms and the slightly negative oxygen atom on neighboring water molecules. Each individual bond is laughably weak. It lasts only a few trillionths of a second before it breaks and reforms. But there are so many of them, trillions upon trillions acting simultaneously, that together they give water a tensile strength that can support a column 300 feet tall. And there may be a limit. The tallest tree on Earth right now is a coast redwood in Northern California, 380 feet roughly. Some researchers believe that 390 to 400 feet may be close to the maximum possible height for a tree. The physics of water transport sets a ceiling. As the tree gets taller, the tension at the top increases, the leaves at the very tip get less and less water, they photosynthesize more slowly, and they grow smaller. Eventually the leaves at the apex are so small and so water-starved that they cannot produce enough sugar to build the next increment of height. Growth grinds to a halt. The tree has reached its hydraulic limit. This means the height of the tallest tree in the world is ultimately determined by the tensile strength of water, the diameter of xylem tubes, and the physics of evaporation. A forest of ancient giants stretching toward the sky is held back by the same intermolecular forces you learned about in chemistry class. The world is built from small things. Think about that. The whole system, the 100 gallons a day, the 300 feet of height, the entire hydrological cycle of a forest hangs on a bond that is individually so weak you would never notice it. But collectively it moves oceans through trees. This is what I love about physics. You start with a tree, an ordinary tree, something you walk past every day without thinking. And you ask a simple question. How does the water get up there? And the answer takes you through atmospheric pressure, surface tension, molecular bonding, thermodynamic metastability, biological engineering, and evolutionary trade-offs. One question, asked carefully, opens up the whole world, and we still do not have the complete answer. The tree has been doing this for 400 million years, long before there were physicists, long before there were textbooks, long before anyone thought to ask how. It just does it. Quietly, every day, hundreds of gallons, hundreds of feet, against gravity, without a pump. There is a German botanist from the early 1900s, a man named Otto Renner, who studied this problem deeply. He was a supporter of the cohesion-tension theory. He provided important experimental evidence for it, but even he recognized that the story was not complete. He wrote that the turgor of the living cells around the xylem vessels must be in equilibrium with the pressure inside the vessels. In other words, the living tissue and the dead pipes are not independent. They are coupled. What happens in the pipes affects the living cells, and what the living cells do affects the pipes. That insight was largely ignored for decades. The cohesion-tension theory was so elegant, so satisfying, that nobody wanted to complicate it. But Renner was right. The tree is an integrated system. The dead pipes and the living tissue work together in ways we are only beginning to unravel. I have a friend who studies mangrove trees. Mangroves grow in salt water. The ocean water around their roots is so salty that by all rights water should flow out of the roots and into the sea, not the other way around. Osmosis should drain the tree dry. But mangroves generate such enormous tensions in their xylem, 3 to 5 megapascals, which is 30 to 50 atmospheres of negative pressure, that they actually pull fresh water out of salt water. They desalinate the ocean, using nothing but evaporation and molecular cohesion. If you wanted to desalinate seawater using human technology, you would need reverse osmosis membranes and high-pressure pumps, consuming enormous amounts of electricity. A mangrove does it with leaves and wood, and it has been doing it for millions of years without maintenance, without spare parts, without an engineering degree. So where does this leave us? We know the water goes up, we know evaporation drives it. We know cohesion holds the water together. We know the tensions involved are enormous and the water is in a metastable state. We know cavitation happens and gets repaired. We know living cells play a role we do not fully understand. And we know that the simplest version of the story, one force pulling water through passive pipes, is probably too simple. The real picture is likely a collaboration of forces. Tension from above, a small push from below, osmotic gradients in the surrounding tissue, active repair mechanisms, careful architectural design that balances speed against safety, and 400 million years of natural selection, fine-tuning every detail. We understand the broad strokes, but the fine details, the molecular choreography, the way a tree manages its internal water supply moment by moment, how it repairs damage under impossible thermodynamic conditions, how it prevents catastrophic failure when the physics says failure should be inevitable, those details are still being worked out, and I find that thrilling, not frustrating. Thrilling, because it means there is still something to discover. There is still a puzzle inside the tree. One of the most ordinary objects in the world, something a child could draw with a crayon, is doing something that the smartest physicists and biologists alive have not completely figured out. Next time you walk past a tree, stop for a moment. Put your hand on the bark. Underneath your fingers, right now, water is being pulled upward through tubes thinner than a hair against gravity under negative pressure in a state that should not exist in nature. Hundreds of gallons of it. No motor, no noise, no fuss. The tree is performing a physics experiment that we cannot fully replicate in a laboratory, and it has been doing it since before the dinosaurs, since before there were flowers, before there were birds, before there were mammals. The first trees appeared nearly 400 million years ago, and they were already solving the water transport problem. They had to. If you cannot get water to your top, you cannot be tall. And if you cannot be tall, someone else will be taller and shade you out, and you will die. The evolutionary pressure to move water upward has been relentless for hundreds of millions of years. And the result is this quiet, invisible marvel happening right now in every tree you can see from your window. I would love to know what surprises you most about this. Is it the negative pressure? The cavitation? The fact that we still do not have the whole picture? Tell me what sticks in your mind. That is usually where the next good question is hiding.